tweak it a little bit. Or you might say, there's one I know that's not on here, and it's this. Or you as a group might say, we have to write our own. We want to write our own definition. Okay. So there's different options.
The FDA just came out with a statement saying that rapid tapering or discontinuation is harmful. And so I wonder if we do need to incorporate the FDA's recent statement around rapid discontinuation.
Yep. Good. But before, I don't want to talk about the definition yet, but did you have a comment on the overall process, please?
I actually want to back up for a second.
Absolutely.
To the outline.
Go for it.
I would like to add a section for special patient populations that specifically addresses oncology, palliative, hospice, and end-of-life patients as a separate category in this, because we're seeing an increase in patients within those populations who have concomitant history of chemical dependency or opiate use disorder, and those need to be managed very differently. And those are the patients that I've seen really fall through the cracks where they're having these other guidelines applied to them. So unless there's objection, I would love to add that to the agenda.
Yeah, to the outline?
To the outline.
Dana.
Arian, can you just restate? I heard hospice, palliative care. There was a third.
So oncology, palliative, and then hospice and end of life, which I find that people confuse palliative and hospice and end of life. They actually are three separate categories that get lumped into one. So I think if we can define those populations fully and then how this would apply to them.
That's great. Good.
And along those lines, I like how you said special populations. You probably want to include maternity care and pregnancy in there, or somewhere.
Yeah.
Good. Great.
And probably peds if we're going to get that specific.
If Helen was here, she would tell us that. So yes.
Okay, so adding a section on the outline about special patient populations, oncology, palliative, hospice, end-of-life, maternity care, and peds. And again, if we decide, we're missing a big one or something like that, we can always come back. But I really appreciate that. Okay, so back into the sort of the way we can have this definition is just to sort of, this discussion is just to sort of walk through this, and we're going to be taking really careful notes. And so again, the ideal as we move through this is, okay, look, a tapering definition. And we don't, I understand, especially on some of the stuff that we have to wordsmith. I want to be really careful of not wordsmithing too much because it's really painful as a huge group to try to do this. But I also understand language is powerful and it's important. And so what I would say is, let's start with concepts, right? And then we can try to come up with definitions. And then again, we'll go away and try to work on it and bring it back to you. But so that's how we're just going to sort of march through these. If that feels okay to folks, and see how far we get on the definitions. And then at some point we'll see how y'all are doing. We can take a break or so. I won't make you sit and do this nonstop until 4:30. Okay, David.
Well, sure. I'll jump
go.
You can turn it on. You turn it on.
And then you have to wait.
First thing that I have to say, I don't want to hot.
So all of these in tapering seem to be the same, except for the VA one, which is a little bit more complicated. But I think so. My suggestion would be we take the CDC one and say consistent with all the others, and be done.
What David said.
Second, third.
So use this. That'll be really good. Use the CDC definition.
Yeah.
And then say and consistent with.
It is consistent.
Oh, it is
with.
consistent with.
It is consistent with all these others, so that people know that there's not.
Got
it's not
it.
a unique.
We're saying the same thing.
They're all saying
Got
the
it.
same. I mean, we can. There's no reason to tweak that one. I don't think.
Yeah.
Okay.
VA has to
So
put
that's-
more letters, more words.
Yeah, so are folks comfortable using the CDC? Yep, definition. Anybody on the phone, Mark, Michelle? Does that feel comfortable?
Yes, I support that.
Great.
Yes, I do too.
Fantastic. Okay.
One job. This is easy.
Okay, let's look at the next, on opioid tolerance definition. And that's, go ahead, Dana.
Just for clarification, so you'll see on the next couple, we had initially pulled language from each of the different guidelines. They all referenced in one way or another the DSM-5 criteria, appropriately so. So we just brought you the DSM-5 criteria instead of negotiating different ways to say the DSM-5 criteria. So if you guys disagree, of course, tell us, but that's why you only see that listed.
So does anybody are folks in agreement with using the DSM-5 criteria for opioid tolerance definition, opioid withdrawal definition, and opioid? So it goes on to the next page. To opioid use disorder addiction definition.
Does that really say to achieve intoxication and opioid tolerance? That's a interesting bit.
Doesn't seem like it needs to say that.
Yeah.
So the question is we'll take them one by one. The opioid tolerance definition. So maybe your question is, it says to achieve
intoxication. That's, I mean, we're talking about patients that are taking opioids and they're taking it for pain.
Right.
We never say they want more so they can be more intoxicated. I would say the desired effect probably would be better. That just doesn't sound correct to me, but I'm not a psychiatrist.
Is this verbatim out of DSM?
Yeah.
Is that it?
It is.
It is.
Interesting.
I was under the impression.
Don't just talk loud.
I'll do my okay. I thought ASAM had a little bit different definition around some of these that had a little neutral language.
ASAM?
Yeah, I don't remember off the top of my head. I was asking. I think they do, and I just would like to compare the language of that versus the diagnostic.
That's totally fine. I think you're right as well. I thought another option we could use would be to achieve desired effect, whether therapeutic or recreational, just seems less loaded.
Whether therapeutic or recreational.
Yeah.
This was out of the DSM-5 criteria. We didn't make up any information, but I appreciate the concern about how that feels.
So two suggestions. So Kim's suggestion to look at the
ASAM.
How do you say it?
ASAM.
ASAM. That's right. Okay. To look at that, and then Eve's suggestion that it would say that we might say something to achieve desired effect, whether it be therapeutic or recreational. David.
Yeah, I mean, one of our principles is to be evidence-based.
Yeah.
And so I think we have to have some reference rather than just a bunch of us sitting in a room coming up with a definition.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that goes with the suggestion. Change is not different really from the DSM. It's just put in a more user-friendly language. But again, I think each one of these ought to reference something other than ourselves.
Good.
Right.
Great. Good, Katrina.
We'll see if this works. All right, maybe I'll, still doesn't work, right?
Nope.
Okay. So what I was going to say is that these guidelines, I know we've been focused for our other prescribing on pain and both acute pain and chronic pain, but this sentence prompted me to think that tapering guidelines could, of course, be used for patients who were heroin users, for example, not necessarily been prescribing pain to decrease. So that would be a reason to include. I agree with the statement that was made that we're primarily doing this in order to look at how we're treating patients who've been on high-dose opioids and been prescribed those, but it could be the principles for these guidelines and being compassionate, et cetera, might pertain to patients who were addicted to illicit opioids as well. So I'm agreeing with the sentence. It just sort of dawned on me that all of our prescribing guidelines have been thinking about prescription opioids and tolerance to prescription, and it's about pain patients, and it's within the healthcare system. But these principles could hold for illicit drinks.
But if somebody's using it illicit, you can't really taper them, right? Like if they're getting them from the street, how are you going to? Yeah.
Unless they want to, and I guess that's the point.
I think this should be for that.
So hold on. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, it seems to me that we were sort of chatting aside here. We don't prescribe heroin.
No.
Yeah.
Right, so I don't even know what it means to say these principles apply to a heroin user. I mean, because I can't say I'm going to cut your drug. I can't cut what the person gets on the street or how that person doses themselves. So it doesn't really.
Yeah.
We
it's not within our purview to do that.
So Kim, did you have a comment?
No, I was just kind of commenting on that too. I mean, that could be a confusing fact, right?
So what we've heard, this one works good, is that many people who are on prescription opioids can often use illicit drugs at the same time. And these people might come in wanting to be tapered off of their dependence, et cetera, to opioids. That was my only comment. Maybe I shouldn't have even made it. I was actually agreeing that using it, quote, recreationally, I mean, whether therapeutic or recreationally, this could be considered in a larger context. Again, I've heard it quite a bit. If people can't and we're tapering off or they're not getting their prescription opioids, don't all those people turn to either street prescription opioids, that is pills they're buying on the street, and or heroin or fentanyl or some combination. So it was a simple comment. It was actually agreeing. So I didn't mean, suddenly all the heroin addicts are coming in and we're tapering them off. It was more that I think that some of these, and just to be aware, many patients are only getting these treated within a medical setting, but that's a lot of what we hear is as you're tamping down on these prescriptions, many of those folks are going over to street drugs, whether they be pills or heroin or whatever. I don't know how true that is, but that's part of the context that we're hearing. That was my
Suboxone comes in versus tapering down prescription opioids. That's when you would do opioid use disorder treatment. So I think that's like in a different.
So to that point, maybe, and it again gets back to the recreational, maybe it doesn't include intoxication or recreation. That's how we started, with the DSM-5 criteria here. But maybe that's a separate call-out section that these guidelines are really talking about what's being prescribed in a medical setting, dealing with recreational, for lack of a better use. But illicit use of substances might require other, et cetera. So rather than special, it might be another special population that we refer that whether these guidelines pertain or they need to be treated with, methadone, buprenorphine, Suboxone, et cetera.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would say is that I think you bring up a really valid point about how this can be more nuanced. So putting on my ER hat for a minute, often we do get patients who have dual diagnosis issues going on. And I think the principles that we're talking about here about compassionate, patient-centered, safe treatment options is absolutely applicable in everything we're talking about here to that illicit using population as well. And I would like to, I guess, pose the question as a curiosity of, is there any barrier or limitation to this task force's recommendations that would limit us from making it as applicable to as many patient populations as possible? While our goal here is tapering patients who are on prescribed opiates, the principles are the same fundamentally. And I think that the guiding principles, I guess, where were we?
Yeah.
That are draft principles would apply in both settings. Yeah. And our patients, again, they don't stick to strict lines in terms of which box they fall into.
Good. Dana, do you want to respond to that?
Sure. I mean, I think it's up to the task force to think about the scope that you want to include in the language. I do think in terms of the level of specificity we're going to get to into particular subpopulations or special populations is probably going to be somewhat limited, but certainly how these apply or don't apply would be absolutely within scope, and then how you want to broaden that scope is definitely for you all to discuss and inform.
Kim?
And I think this gets into David's point earlier, when to refer out. If somebody is using heroin or fentanyl, that's usually out of the scope of medical practice and usually within the scope of an SUD practice to make some of those medication-assisted treatment decisions or how they're going to do that. So it's gone. No, it's back. Okay, there we go. So I think that might be one of those discussion points about referral, because we still want to help them. I just don't know that they're within the scope of a tapering specific guideline.
And maybe for now we put them in the think about that as special patient population for now. Paul?
I echo what Kim says. I try to treat prescribed opioid use disorder, POUD.
Right.
Illicit opioid use disorder oftentimes needs inpatient or methadone or something I can't provide in an outpatient setting, so I agree with Kim.
Good. Okay.
If I could, I'll play the devil's advocate. 2 points really. One is that I'm not sure that we want to include include that population in this guideline because there's a lot of confusion around what an appropriate MED for somebody on medication-assisted treatment should be versus somebody on chronic opioid therapy, and also the goal of somebody in MAT is not necessarily to taper, but to keep them stabilized on a continual dose. And I would also challenge, coming from primary care and representing primary care practices, I would challenge you to think that we can absolutely treat this patient in any setting. And what I see in our community is that the pain providers do not treat these patients, and they're harmed because they're discharged without really a referral to nowhere because they don't want to receive methadone or something else. So, and many of them do want Suboxone or Subutex, and we can provide that in primary care or anywhere, really.
And there's plenty of data actually from the emergency medicine world about initiating Suboxone, buprenorphine from the ED for patients with chemical dependency, showing that it actually decreases use and more likelihood of them succeeding in going to MAT programs. So I get that this is sort of a nebulous rabbit hole we can go chasing down, but I also ultimately think we are the last safety net, like speaking with my ER hat, and these patients will walk into our doors, and I would love for us to be able to include providers on a vast scale with some tools to actually address that. To BJ's point, they get lost otherwise.
So I want to hear from Safina and Eve and then Kim.
I have a suggestion because I agree with Brandon, right? BJ, thank you. So, see how it's right? Okay. So I agree with BJ, especially to the point that it shouldn't just be in a where to refer section, because we are trying to very hard to incorporate these services within primary care. But I have a suggestion. I don't see it here, and if it is here, I missed it. There should be a category of when tapering meets opioid use disorder, because then we can call out these situations, but not, okay, we're going to have an entire guideline on how to treat opioid use disorder, but it's when tapering meets opioid use disorder, what can you do? Okay, within your organization, you provide the service, here's what you do. If you don't, then maybe you refer to various places, but that's a big nuance that I think is really powerful, that concept, because it shows the gray area between the two, the overlap between the two, and there's a lot of content that would be super helpful.
That's great. So I want to hear from Eve, Kim, and then Joe, and then Jim.
I totally agree, Sabina, with what you said. That's like beautiful. I agree that I wouldn't want to see. I wouldn't want to see treatment of opioid use disorder kind of like relegated to a small section, like it's a special population or it's only for referrals. It is a special population. It is sometimes one to refer. It's other times managed in primary care. I would love to see it in a lot of different places, because very frequently in the setting of tapering prescribed opioids, we're going to uncover a use disorder. And so lots of different references to consider MAT in this case. Refer, prescribe, all the MAT options. So again, we don't need to get into like how to do MAT, but I would expect to see all over the place references to like, now MAT is appropriate. We need to be thinking about that now.
Kim.
Yeah, I just agree with everything they said.
Wait, did you say agree or disagree?
Agree.
Agree. That's why the mics are helpful. It's all right.
It is, yeah, okay, so still have to be smarter than the mic. I'll work that out by 4:30. But I totally agree, and I think a tapering guideline does have to highlight the need for primary care to get their Data 2000 waiver. Often when you taper, you are going to find a use disorder, but or you're going to find the emerging concept that the person just can't taper, and they're not necessarily a use disorder, but they're chronic and persistent opioid dependent. I think my suggestion was more on the illicit drug spectrum. There is a line that we don't cross in those settings because we're not an outpatient treatment center, and so I do think that there has to that's what I was referring to when I said we need to have that goes into a referral guideline. There's things that not medical facilities aren't going to own. That's more within the SUD world.
So Joe and then Jim.
So my thought was just that there are a lot of very smart people in this room who are used to treating lots of different substance use disorder and opioid dependence. What I worry about a little bit is what about the people who aren't so smart? And what I see are people who practices where somebody's coming in and they have cocaine in the urine and they have ecstasy in the urine. And to tell folks, you know, be compassionate, keep treating them, is not, you know, or what do I do with this person? To know what your level is, to be able to say, that ain't my level. I need to refer that person on. I'm beginning a taper. I need to go somewhere else. And so I understand we want to put everybody into it, but I think we also have to look at people who aren't in the room, who don't understand that you don't continue a taper or resupply the opioid and continue to try to work with somebody who persistently has.
So, Michelle or Mark, you may be maybe in a car. If you could. Oh, hi, Helen. So, if anybody on the phone, if you can mute yourself because we're getting some weird feedback.
Can you hear me? This is Helen.
Yes, hi, Helen. We can hear you. Can you hear us?
Okay, because I can now. I've been here the whole time, but I couldn't talk.
Oh, well, we're glad you can. All right. Thank you. Go ahead, Jim.
You know, by the time the mic got back to me, everybody kind of said what I was thinking. But to talk about what you were saying, Joe, I think the appropriate tapering guideline is going to clearly address the patients that you recognize have substance use disorder. And I would think that we would adopt something that would, you know, make it pretty clear what you do with those folks, because really we're gonna uncover a whole lot of stuff, because these are high dose people. They've been on them for a long time. There's a reason they're there, and as we start to squeeze it, a certain number of those people will be recognized one way or the other as having either opioid use disorder or CPOD, which is, you know, there's a lot of gray here, but I completely agree that when all is said and done, we need to be pretty clear about how we're going to address those folks in these guidelines.
David.
I think when we get to the section of when to consider tapering, we're going to think of two dimensions. One is the patient, and the other is the provider and the provider resources. And so those two things sort of have to match up, because as Kim says, some practices can take fairly complex patients, some practices cannot. And so I think that that's the point at which we're going to give people that branching logic. Because a specialty, an addictions provider that has patients with chronic pain sees cocaine or something else is a different scenario, so we're going to have to call that out. So I think we have to, the structure allows us to do that.
And so what I want, does anybody else have any comments on this? Oh, please, Katrina.
See if this works this time.
Okay. Oh, good.
Yes.
So just, again, one comment about the data. We actually review in our entry program drug overdose deaths and prescription drug overdose, and the tox screens, many, I think most, are polysubstance users. They've got different drugs on board as well as chronic medical conditions. So I just wanted to throw out this list. Definitions includes, of course, opioid use disorder. That's part of a broader substance use. And I think it's what everybody is saying. I understand this isn't going to be everything to everybody, and there are a lot of things that need to be treated. But I think we have to call out, whether it's a special population or something specific, but many of these patients, it isn't quite, oh, they've been getting prescription opioids for their pain, and now we're weaning them off of this. They could easily be taking other substances to sort of offset that, and we need to be aware of that. So again, that's based on the data of the folks that we see who are dying of drug overdose deaths.
So I guess I'm wondering if, I guess as a suggestion to address lots of very valid points, maybe one of the things we could create is sort of a roles and responsibilities sort of definition, maybe, of, you know, this is sort of like primary approach to your patient who may have a chemical dependency issue, and then, you know, first pass appropriate management may be XYZ, but if this is beyond your scope of practice and your experience level, then the next step would be to refer to chemical dependency and maybe creating a definition of what that scope and responsibility is, sort of for primary versus specialty care.
And I think that's sort of where David and others were going. So I think that we're sort of coming together around this, that it's not just special population, or you should just, if you can't do it, you should just refer them out, right? But make more nuance than that and be super clear. I mean, what I've heard people say, and this isn't the right language, but that we have to address in here, if your practice, if your organization, if you identify this, X, and your organization has the capacity and capability to do X, then do X. If it doesn't, here are other ways you can refer to address that, right? And that could be, I mean, what I heard is opioid use disorder, that's going to be in here. It could be specifically on illicit drug use. There could, probably want to refer that out, whatever that is. But I think what I hear is we can't do it all, right? We know we can't address everything in this guideline, and there are key pieces here that we don't want to leave out. We don't want, right? What you don't want is the primary care provider to go, well, I have to go on that decision tree and go, well, I have this, but the branch ends there, right? What's the next? Where do I go from there? Go ahead, Dana.
Just to respond, great conversation. In response to your comment, Arian, about specifically definitions, I would suggest or consider, well, one, if you all have a definition you want to bring on that specifically, please do, but I'd actually recommend we make it more of an iterative process. This is going to come up in the content as we go forward, as it's been called out. And then if we feel like we need to pull it out as a separate definition, we can do that. I'm not quite sure how we would capture that in a concise definition, but it's clearly needing to be included in the guidelines itself. So, but if we find that we need a definition, we can certainly pull it out. We'll make a note of that.
I'm now going to bring us back to the definitions. This is a great conversation. So we were looking at opioid tolerance definition, talked about looking at the Assam piece, and then also thinking about tweaking it to say desired effect, whether therapeutic or recreational. And I think to David's point, we probably want to reference in a footnote or something just what the DSM-5 says, so that folks know we tweaked it and bring that back to you. Opioid withdrawal syndrome, opioid withdrawal definition, apologize. Anything there, again, comes from the DSM-5. Folks okay with that? Looking at opioid withdrawal syndrome definition again, the DSM-5.
You might want to say what that syndrome is. I mean, for the it's like.
Say it louder, David.
Well, it doesn't tell you what the syndrome is or what you might look at. I mean,
it seems you can't. It's basically telling you to look at another definition.
Right.
It's right, okay. So I see. Well, then
we can organize that different. We can do whatever you want. We can organize it so it's more clear the connection between the two. Or all the experts in the room, if you have a different suggestion on how we include that, please let us know.
Yeah, so look at the next one as well.
So have we agreed on opioid tolerance? Look at ASAP.
We have to look at the ASAP.
Okay. And everyone's good with withdrawal?
Yeah. So anything on those withdrawal syndrome definition or opioid use disorder addiction definition?
I would just reverse the order when we put it in the guideline.
Yeah.
Good.
Can I ask a question? So I'm sorry, with the definitions, what would the order be then for the definitions?
Well, I think top tapering definition, then tolerance, then opiate withdrawal syndrome definition, and then opiate withdrawal definition.
Okay.
Because the withdrawal syndrome actually says what that is, and then the other one references it without the definition.
Taper, tolerance, withdrawal,